All right, just like with a lot of videos on an Israel-related topic, this isn't exactly one where I can actually get people who agree with me. I think my viewpoints are very much out of the norm. They're really outliers. And usually I preface it, and I'll do it again by saying that my parents were both born in Israel. And I also served in the Israeli army. Even though I was born here, I had Israeli citizenship by virtue of the fact that both of my parents were Israeli. So I automatically had legally the draft requirement over there if I ever went to visit as an adult. So I was willing to do it anyway. But that's not what this video is about. I had a little bit of a small debate yesterday with a friend of mine who was trying to say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a great prime minister. He's a great leader, and basically, I could not disagree more. Now, I want to separate a few things out of this debate. There is a such thing as being a great statesman, but also being a horrible leader. There is a such thing as being a great politician, but a horrible leader. For example, I would say that FDR was an amazing politician, a great statesman, but in retrospect, he wasn't a great leader because a lot of the problems that we're dealing with as Americans come from FDR. They come from his time in office. So my premise here is that Bibi is not great. And that is as somebody who has lived in Israel, but also has been an outsider and observed it from abroad. And I can tell you that a lot of my friends and family who still live there, and or who never left, for that matter, who were born there and lived there their entire lives, they own businesses or they work there. They know that he's basically been a charlatan. He's done incredible damage to Israel as a society because of his very personal approach to politics. Now, I will say there are things that I think are very praiseworthy about his career that are besides just winning elections and things like that, which we'll also get to. But first of all, he was one of the key implementers of economic liberalization of the Israeli economy in the early 2000s. And it was a painful time for him to do that because it was during the Second Intifada. So a lot of the changes that he did were very painful at the time because many people were having economic troubles. But ultimately, as finance minister, which is a job that people forget that he had, that I think was Benjamin Netanyahu's finest hour, despite the fact that even at the time I thought it was wrong. I had different viewpoints when I was a teen, basically, as far as the economy is concerned, and as far as somebody who lived there is concerned. And other positive things I think he did were to basically, fight back against the press and the media as far as their bias, their political bias on a number of topics. So I'm not here to indict him totally for, decades of work. So what are the other positives of his life? He was, in many ways, the real statesman of Israel in our time, meaning that when he would go to a visit to a foreign country, whether it was Russia or France or even China or the the USA, at least it could be conceivable that Israel was approaching an equal footing with a lot of these countries that have much larger economies or much larger populations, have more power in the world. Benjamin Netanyahu did make Israel into a more powerful country on the international stage, and it shows through his interactions with Vladimir Putin, his interactions with the Obama and Trump administrations. And I think you can't forget that he also opened very new chapters in the relationship between Israel and India, as well as between Arab states and Israel, which I think are certainly commendable. The other thing I think that is his strong point is that as a political strategist. So these are things that are great points of accomplishment on his part. And this is before I get to all the negative stuff. So I already said statesmanship, and I already said that his finance ministry turn were good points. But what he was also very good at, which is not really, this is in the greater politician area as opposed to great leader area, is that he, for over a decade, he destroyed opponents of his who were always trying to steal the brass ring and become the next big thing, and they never could seem to get it. And there's just a laundry list of names of people like that, from Amir Peretz to Tzipi Livni to Moshe Kahlon, Avigdor Lieberman, who's still involved in politics, and finally Naftali Bennett did succeed in dethroning him, but it took a lot of effort. And by the way, I think Naftali Bennett, so if you think I'm going to be criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu here in this video, I would say Naftali Bennett is going to probably end up being one of the worst prime ministers in Israel's history, one of the bad world leaders, one of the world leaders who leads to more damage for their country. But more on that either later or in a different video. So one of the things that I want to get to as far as his how he was a terrible leader was that during the 2000s, when he was one of the cabinet ministers in the administration of Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister in the early 2000s, Netanyahu would make a lot of noise about opposing the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, which has turned out to actually have been a strategic mistake on the part of Israel, even though I don't know what the real answer should have been, because I don't know whether if Israel would have stayed in, the Gaza Strip would have improved, and Hamas would have been prevented from taking power there. But we do know what did happen when they did withdraw, which is that Hamas did take over. And before that, Netanyahu would make a lot of noise about how it's completely unjust and that it's a huge betrayal on the part of his party, the Likud party, which both him and Sharon were part of, and that it needed to be put to a national referendum. But ultimately, Benjamin Netanyahu did vote for the resolution to proceed with the Gaza withdrawal in the cabinet and in a number of forms. He would vote sometimes yes, he would vote sometimes no. And he had a very ambiguous position on this, because on the one hand, he wanted to show to the public that he was against it. And on the other hand, if he would actively torpedo it, he would have been fired from his position in the cabinet. So he couldn't have both. So basically he would make a lot of noise about, I'm against this. But in reality, he was very weak in his position. And I think it shows certainly that for him, it really is politics. It's not about policy, right? And there's many cases where another example is he opposed the Gaza ceasefire that was called in 2008 by Ehud Olmert, who was the prime minister after Ariel Sharon. Why am I saying that this was a negative thing? Look, the ceasefire itself accomplished nothing. The offensive against Hamas that preceded it also was of dubious accomplishment. But the fact is that while Netanyahu is considered, at least among many, a successful prime minister, and Ehud Olmert is considered a colossal failure and a corrupt loser among almost all Israelis, they both supported ceasefires. Netanyahu, during his prime ministry, I think he had 3 different offensives against the Hamas administration of Gaza, the Hamas regime. And every time it ended with a ceasefire, obviously, because it's still there. So all of his very big talk about dealing with Hamas and finally eradicating terror, which he's talked about for many, many years. In fact, he was talking about it in the 90s when he was first running for prime minister before he served his first term in office, which I'm also going to get to. He would talk about how the real answer to creating a new Middle East is to first fight the terror and then deal with what to do with the Palestinians and other Muslim countries that were considered at the time rogue states, like Iraq and Iran, which is a non-Arab country, Syria. So he had a lot of very interesting theories about how to deal with things, but when the time came for him to actually do it, he couldn't follow through, because ultimately when the United States would pressure Israel to agree to a ceasefire, or when, I guess, his own resolve would crack, Benjamin Netanyahu would crack, just like the other Israeli prime ministers who have had this same issue have done, just like Bennett will do. Bennett also would make like a huge show of having a big dick and being able to take care of terrorism. And in the end, all of them seem to crumble in the same way, because the real problem, in my opinion, that many people don't want to address is that Israel remains, to some extent, dependent on its relationship with the United States. And I find that to be negative. I think it should pursue as independent of a foreign policy as it can. I think America should also pursue an independent foreign policy. I think any country, you can't remain dependent on other countries. That's why NATO should have been retired a while ago and replaced maybe with a totally different format. These are larger issues that I don't think are unique to Israel, but I think you can still criticize Israel for issues that are common to it in other countries, right? So those are a couple of the primary reasons that I would criticize him, but there's more. In 1997, when he was first prime minister, Netanyahu, after years of yelling about how the labor government under Yitzhak Rabin was surrendering to the PLO and giving land for blood and things like that instead of land for peace, he gave away Hebron, or Hebron in Hebrew, Khalil in Arabic. So this is one of the more ancient cities in Israel. It's in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, as the Jews would call it. So he basically, again, something that he complained about when he was in the opposition, he did exactly like his predecessor did when he became prime minister. And by the way, this happens very commonly with people who, when they run for higher office, they say they're going to do one thing, they criticize their opponent for doing one thing, the incumbent, and then when they get into there, they behave like the incumbent. Donald Trump would do things like that concerning the national debt and the budgets and airstrikes on foreign countries and things like that. It is what it is. You have to criticize people for things that they do wrong. And certainly, I think people mistake criticism for Israel, criticism for the government of Israel, and sometimes for the state of Israel, for hatred of it. But the truth is that if I have a philosophy that I think is correct, and I think I need to apply it as consistently as I can, and I think something is wrong, it would be wrong for me to be biased in favor of people who are so close to me when I would call other people wrong for doing the same thing, right? And I'm not saying that we have to condemn Benjamin Netanyahu as the devil for things that he's done, or condemn Israel as a country for, the actions that it has taken under his command, because there are people on the left who condemn it as a modern-day apartheid state, and there are people in Israel, by the way, on the right, who say that it is betraying the Jewish people as a whole by even entertaining surrendering land to the Palestinians. So criticism is present everywhere. It's just very different in the way that it's applied, very different depending on the values of the person criticizing. So the values that I'm applying to Netanyahu are personal values that are mine. So I feel that based on these values, he is far from a great politician. But I haven't even finished. So the other issue with Netanyahu, and I don't feel that he's different from other Israeli prime ministers of recent times, is that I don't think that he's a person who is true to a real freedom of speech position, right? And I'm not saying that he is supposed to be. I'm not saying that this is something he claims to be, But a lot of these Israeli leaders, they do have some affinity to social media censorship. And believe me, it would be an easier world for people like me if there was nobody online who would spew hatred at you for your religion, for being Jewish, in my case, for being whatever the other case would be. There is online hatred against Christians, against pagans, against Muslims, I guess, against Hindus and things like that. So it would be a much easier world if there were if there was banning. Not even banning, but if the people who had hateful opinions couldn't post their stuff online. But then the easier world is really a utopian ideal that can never happen. So all of these attempts to have Facebook, Twitter, and other social media companies screen tweets and screen other forms of communication for anti-Semitic speech, while well-intentioned on their face, are ultimately horrible ideas, and in the end, they actually amplify, believe me, they amplify the desire by people to spread these types of messages, because the forbidden is always something that's more attractive. It goes back to the Garden of Eden, right? The forbidden fruits, the forbidden speech of hate speech, of anti-Semitism and all that. It is very attractive to younger people who want to be edgy, and it's no different from back in the day when your parents, this is a real trope from the 80s, but your parents would burst into your room and take your rap or heavy metal posters out of your room, and it's no different. But believe me, I'm not trying to say that it's virtuous to insult people based on their religion, race, or ethnicity. I'm just saying that it is wrong for a government such as the Israeli government to call for the policing of hate speech. Recently, Naftali Bennett, who is the successor, and I know that Netanyahu did this himself, he actually called for the censoring of hate speech. I believe, or if it wasn't him, no, it was actually his deputy. His name is Yair Lapid. So this is this is something that happened not long ago, and actually this is interesting because it's from Yeshiva World, which is a Jewish publication, and it says Yair Lapid harmed fight against anti-Semitism on campuses. The ZOA says, and so. By the way, so if the ZOA says that the Zionist Organization of America, it's an interesting take that they're going to have, because they're usually they are very much against anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred, as some people call it. I think the word anti-Semitism is actually a misnomer, but and we can go into that at a different time. But here it is. So the outrage at Foreign Minister Yair Lapid's speech, redefining anti-Semitism as a general phenomenon of hating anyone who is different, has grown, with many slamming his speech as irresponsible. The Zionist Organization of America said that Lapid's speech harmed their efforts at combating anti-Semitism. As the foreign minister of the State of Israel, who by the way, so Yair Lapid is technically slated to become prime minister once Naftali Bennett's turn is over. They did a power sharing agreement. So I'm actually criticizing a future prime minister, by the way. And I have friends who have always been fans of, and relatives who have been fans of Yair Lapid. I personally have no preference either way for him. In fact, before this, I didn't have a problem with him, but this is one of the most boneheaded takes I've ever seen. You delivered a speech that was completely contrary to the interests of the Jewish people. You harmed our ability to continue fighting anti-Semitism on campuses and at international forums. Iluz also accused Lapid of playing into the hands of haters of Israel while also challenging the uniqueness of anti-Semitism. So what did he actually say? Well, he redefined it. He said the anti-Semites weren't only in the Budapest ghetto. Lapid said the anti-Semites were also slave traders who threw people bound together with chains into the sea. Excuse me. The anti-Semites were the Hutu in Rwanda who massacred Tutsis. The anti-Semites are Muslim fanatics who have murdered millions of other Muslims in the past decades. excuse me, the anti-Semites are ISIS and Boko Haram. The anti-Semites are people who beat LGBT people to death. So he basically expanded it, and this is actually not even the thing that I was talking about, but it is also it's also something that's relevant to the conversation because he's broadening the definition. So this is a guy who has also he said that Haredim, who are the ultra-Orthodox Jews, are greedy. He said that a few years ago. So would he himself be culpable for the very same type of anti-Semitism that he has called for, that he has condemned now? Nobody knows. So these are things that I think are important distinctions here. But I do know for a fact, and I'll try to find the source, but Yair Lapid, for example, has called for harsher censorship on social media for anti-Semitism. But the subject here is Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, I would say, he has some of the same biases and some of the same policy positions as these other clowns that were against him, as Bennett, as Yair Lapid. He's called for harsher censorship. So I'm not sure this is the one that I'm talking about, but yeah, they have been very much. Here we go. Netanyahu shares article calling him an icon of the global right. But in any case, I do want to say another thing. So Benjamin Netanyahu, he has all of these areas where people call him based because of his nationalist perspective on the Jewish people, while at the same time he condemns expression of anti-Semitism. His government has worked with Facebook and other companies in order to promote and I wouldn't say he's the worst player. You have the ADL, which I think is the worst of all, where they try to broaden everything into racism and anti-Semitism, and it actually hurts every single thing about these causes, because the real answer to fighting prejudice is to have dialogue with the people who are prejudiced as much as you can, not to turn people into different groups that are in their own silo and don't speak to each other and will not engage in a conversation, because then you have basically parallel societies, and that's where the actual myths and untruths can be spread, things that are untrue. It's better. This is why I'm for removing the censorship of not just libels and things like that, but even things that are outright quackery, false science and things like that, because people should be able to make up their mind. So, and then a final front regarding Netanyahu, and then a word on all of the Israeli prime ministers and why I don't think that he is. I think he's certainly one of the better ones, but he's not a great prime minister. I'll have to explain that. But Netanyahu is one of the people who decided that whoever does not get vaccinated will be left behind. And they have been basically, they have a green badge system that functions as both a carrot and a stick, and the government is making leisure activities accessible only to people who are fully vaccinated or recovered starting Sunday. 2 weeks later, restaurants, event halls, and conferences. So basically, they've been operating under the same domineering system where the government gets to determine what you get to do, where you get to go. You can't leave your house. I had a relative who told me recently that his nephew, I believe it was his nephew, could not go for a visit out of their little kibbutz because they couldn't get a COVID test because they didn't have an ID, or his mother didn't have an ID, and therefore they had to cancel their trip because of these draconian rules, which There are countries that have it even worse, like Australia, but certainly I would say Israel has been a very negative example. They've always tried during this whole coronavirus pandemic to make some sort of grand gesture that they're taking it more seriously than anyone else. And they will fight it as if it is like the real threat to humanity and the Jewish people and the world and whatever. And it's all been for show and been like a huge fucking lie, because the truth is that they have disenfranchised. Remember, this is a country that is based on one of the phrases of their national anthem is to be a free nation in our own land. And instead, they have become their own prisoners in their own land. That's something that it causes me great stress as a person who my ancestors came from this country. My parents were born there. Our heritage as a people comes from there, and yet the values that the Israeli government are imparting to their people are so much against the freedom of those people, the freedom that people have talked about for many years, that Jews shouldn't have to be fearing for their lives and being under the threat of government oppression. That's one of the main themes of it, right? That's one of the reasons they left Russia under the Tsars, Russia under the Soviets. They left. They had to leave Spain because they were kicked out. That's one of the reasons that they would emigrate from some of these Muslim countries, where while you were allowed to live, you couldn't exactly live in the most free and unharassed manner. So I totally condemn this entire response, because in the end, when the government steps in, tells you to make medical decisions or else, and gets between you and your physician, I don't care whether it is the Turkish government, whether it is the Russian government, whether it is the South African government, or whether it is the Israeli government, it is, in my opinion, a corrupt and totalitarian system. I don't care what flag it's flying. And I have many people who agree with me who generally would find themselves maybe not the greatest friends of Israel, but some are. And they can't stand it. And it's really a tragedy. So Bennett has also stepped in and said he was going to require vaccine certificates to attend social events. So here's my position on that. Any leader who wraps themselves in the flag in order to tell you that the way you live your life has to be by the grace of some document that an arbitrary authority issues in order to supposedly protect the public from you, that is a government that is your oppressor. And that's something that people should remember. But remember, so if this was a time of war, like a real war against another country, I would say you could make the case that people should have papers in order to know that you don't have some sort of infiltrator. But now they're turning you into an infiltrator by virtue of your own health. And it really is besmirching, I think, the good reputation of the people of Israel that they're conforming to this, right? And by the way, there are people who will never in their entire lives acknowledge a good word about Israel. I'm not one of those people. I think that it's a country that is a good example of how to at least integrate the majority of your immigrants, most of their immigrants. And when I say immigrants, the majority of these immigrants are Jews, but they're from other countries and cultures. They tend to eventually assimilate and become part of the social fabric. Yes, there are people who don't make it, but I would say they've been more successful than many countries in the West. Go to a country like France and see how divided the society is with all of their immigration. It's certainly better in a country like Israel, because they make a special effort to try and have people cooperate and know that they're all on the same team. But in this case, in the case of the vaccinations, the prime minister, when it was Bibi Netanyahu, and the prime minister when it was Naftali Bennett, it's the same garbage. They're people who are basically taking their hand, the hand of the government, and reaching into your medicine cabinet or your health records and trying to force you into an outcome that you don't have any say-so in. So the last thing I'm going to talk about with that, I'll wrap up. So how does he stack up against the other Israeli prime ministers? So my friend said that he was the best. Benjamin Netanyahu is the best Israeli prime minister since David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister and the person that many call the founder of the country or the father of the country. And in my opinion, you have to go through each one. And obviously, it's a very difficult standard to have if you really look at them. Ben-Gurion, I think, was a much different figure, but he was also sort of a tyrant. He would also oppress his political opponents. If you're and in that case, it was right-wing opponents, the people from the Harut party, the people from the revisionist wing of Zionism. So you have to look at people holistically and see what are their flaws and what are their virtues. What are their virtues and what are their flaws? So Ben-Gurion had a successor who was a weak prime minister, Sharet. He also had another prime minister, Levi Eshkol, who had a successful tenure, right? And there's not very much negative that you can say about Levi Eshkol, besides the fact that he was kind of just a political animal, right? And then the prime minister after him, Golda Meir, is remembered as possibly the worst prime minister because she failed during the Yom Kippur War. And then after her, there was Yitzhak Rabin, who's mostly remembered because of things that happened much later with the Oslo Accords. So that's a very complicated story. So with each one of these people, there are different issues at the time that they are prime minister that color the definition of what made them a good prime minister or a bad prime minister. Just like you can't really compare necessarily Grover Cleveland, who was president of the U.S. when we relatively had fewer wars and fewer involvements, to Richard Nixon, who was inheriting the Vietnam War. So it's hard to give people the same standards when they don't face the same challenge. And another prime minister after Rabin, Shimon Peres, considered by many a very divisive prime minister, right? Somebody who on the left is considered basically, one of the greatest statesmen of all time and a premier negotiator and everything like that because he was in politics for so many years. But people who honestly assess him, they know that he was basically someone who he would create problems and then he would never take responsibility for them. And this was over many, many decades, including the 80s when apparently he helped to bankrupt the country. You also have Yitzhak Shamir, who is considered a good prime minister by many because he was very hard on terrorism, but a bad prime minister because he was weak on economics. You have Menachem Begin, who is considered a good prime minister by some because he was very much in favor of involving the minorities, the people from Oriental countries, like my mother's family from Iraq. He was considered a good prime minister in that respect because he wanted them to be more involved. He wanted to embrace them as people who could really be in the leadership and not just not just being like the menial workers as they were at the time. So he's positively remembered for things like that. He's positively remembered for being the first opposition leader to win and end the one-party monopoly in Israel of the Socialist Party, the Mapai Party. And he brought the Likud Party into power. On the other hand, he's viewed negatively by some because he traded land for peace. People on the right don't like him because he traded the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty that hasn't yielded too much in terms of real peace and coexistence with Egypt. It's been more peace, but less coexistence. And then you have Rabin again, and then you have Peres again, and then you have Netanyahu, and then you have Ehud Barak, who's considered one of the worst prime ministers, and then you have Ariel Sharon, who, again, the same idea as Begin. So each person who is, and you can read about these people more in depth later, but, I'm not going to tell you the exact history of the country now that I only have about a few minutes left. But you have to remember that judging people by the standard of how they're able to get elected, as Netanyahu was very good at, or by the fact that they could do like a lot of very good talking overseas. Like he was one of the greatest people at going overseas and getting an audience with other leaders, and sometimes getting concessions. But if you look domestically, Benjamin Netanyahu was an awful prime minister. The coronavirus, I think, should be part of his legacy, the failure of his government with the coronavirus and destroying the civil liberties of his people, who are they're my people too, because a lot of my family live there, my own personal family. So I don't think that my freedom is separate from theirs. I think that they deserve the same freedoms as I do. The Israeli government doesn't, but I can't do anything about that. So I can only criticize their government for what they're doing. And in terms of his management of the country and its policies, right? This is a guy who, as prime minister, he's mainly focused on Iran. He's mainly and he's now not prime minister anymore, if you're talking about Netanyahu. But he's mainly focused, and this isn't Netanyahu, but he's focused mainly on scaremongering, on telling people that the next war is right around the corner. The next war will always be around the corner. What are you doing about the world as it is day to day? What are you doing about making people's education better? What are you doing about making the country's infrastructure better? What are you doing about maybe expanding the country's personal freedoms? Allowing people, like, for example, an opinion that I would propose that an Israeli would find ridiculous would be something like our Second Amendment. But why not? You're seeing people basically being arrested, not being allowed to attend services over a virus that the Israeli people generally were not too hardly affected by. And now that they're mostly been vaccinated, Israel has some of the worst vaccine outcomes, right? So they have a lot of breakthrough infections. And this is even from Newsweek. So Israel, due to Benjamin Netanyahu's wise leadership, this genius, according to some people, they over-vaccinated all their people. They've basically said, "Dear Balak," meaning be careful if you or beware if you don't take this, you're not going to have a life. So they force people basically to take it. And now the statistics are turning against them because a lot of these people are getting breakthrough infections. Even Newsweek is talking about it. And look, I think that your health should be between you and your doctor. You should not have a government, I don't care what flag it is, flying, intervening in your own personal health decisions. So I would say because of things like that, I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is great at all. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me on BitChute and Rumble and Odyssey for my videos, and follow me on Gab and Minds, and throw me a couple bucks on Subscribestar.